14? Did we make it all the way to 14?
1 Samuel chapter 14.
Yeah, we did.
And I can pretty well guarantee you we will not get through that chapter tonight because that is one of the longest chapters in the book.
Oh, yeah, it is. Wow. 2.5.
We're going to break that up between now and Sunday night.
Yeah, that's 3 pages worth.
Yep. All right. 1 Samuel 14, verse 1. Now, at this point, this sort of switches gears a little bit. As far as we can tell, this is still a follow-up to the skirmish that had been at least briefly discussed in chapter 13. But we're looking at this point at definitely a different battle, potentially anywhere from a few days to even a few weeks after the events of chapter 13. But what we see here is, this is not the first time Jonathan has been mentioned, but it's the first focus we have on Jonathan. And I think the point of chapter 14 is to draw a comparison between Jonathan and Saul. Jonathan is described as a man of great faith who is clearly not just a military but a spiritual leader in comparison with his father Saul, who is a blithering idiot. I mean, that's just the way it is. And I think what puzzles me the most, and I think the only answer to this, is Jonathan's relationship with David, which at this point has not yet happened. But Jonathan would have been the crown prince. Saul gets killed. Jonathan is the oldest. He would have ascended to the throne. And clearly, Jonathan was throne material. He could have successfully and spiritually led the nation of Israel. But yet God did not allow Jonathan to do that, but rather took the throne away from the family of Saul completely and moved it to David. Now we realize that, yes, that's a fulfillment of prophecy that goes back to the time of Jacob. But as for why God did not allow Jonathan to be the king, even though he was a man of faith, well, God chooses who God's going to choose. We really have no answers other than that's just what God decided he was going to do. But
God said so.
Huh?
God said so.
Yeah, well, that's true. That comes down to it. It's because I said so. There's your buddy.
Hey, girl.
Anyway, verse 1. It says, "Now the day came that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who was carrying his armor, 'Come and let us cross over to the Philistines' garrison that is on yonder side.' But he did not tell his father." So what you got here is just two men, Jonathan and his armor bearer. Now we know from the previous chapter, Jonathan has a sword. We're not told whether his armor bearer had one or not. We can assume that the likelihood is that he might not have, but as the battle that we're about to be told progresses, I have no doubt that he probably managed to get one pretty quickly, and we'll see why here shortly. Verse 2 said, "And Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah under the pomegranate tree, which is in Migron, and the people who were with him were about 600 men. Now, you'll notice in chapter 13, Saul's army had already been whittled down in chapter 13 to a mere 600. So we see that these 600 are still there. But as we progress into chapter 14, we find where the rest of the 3,000 men that had been with Saul have disappeared to. A bunch of them just took off and deserted. But apparently there was another significant contingent that committed treason against Israel and actually deserted to the Philistines and joined the Philistine army.
That's not good.
No, it wasn't good. But we'll see the evidence of that shortly. Verse 3 says, And Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the priest of the Lord at Shiloh, was wearing an ephod, and the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Now, to cut through all of the confusion on that, Ahijah was Eli's grandson. Now, if Eli was high priest, guess what that makes Ahijah? He's the high priest now. Because remember what happened to Eli's sons. God killed them for disobedience. So the high priesthood has now passed to Ahijah. Or Ahijah would have actually, but anyway, we won't dicker over the pronunciation.
But he had another son, Phineas.
And he got axed also.
But not before he had a child.
But not before he had a child. And you'll recall that we're actually told when he was killed in battle, when his widow was informed of that, she had apparently just given birth, as you'll recall. All right. In fact, that's what put her into labor, was the
news.
The news, it emotionally upset her that she went into labor.
The Lord has left us.
What's that?
The Lord has left us.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, this is Eli's grandson, which means with his Eli gone, his dad gone, Ahijah is now the high priest. And again, you'll notice with Shiloh having been burned to the ground, there is no tabernacle at this point. The Philistines had burned that. So the high priest and the Ark of the Covenant were wherever the ad hoc capital is. Now here's another thing. You notice it said that Saul was in the outskirts of Gibeah under the pomegranate tree. There was no permanent palace at this point. In fact, there's no capital at this point. It's wherever the king decided to hang his hat. The practice at that time was that he pretty much would they'd set up an ad hoc throne for him wherever he happened to be, and he'd hold court right there out in the countryside under the tree, wherever they happened to be. And wherever he was is apparently, at least not too far away, is where they had the Ark of the Covenant and the high priest.
Can I ask something? How come Samuel wasn't the high priest? Just because he wasn't direct blood, or?
Probably because Samuel didn't want to be the high priest. Samuel's keep in mind, Samuel is the adopted son of Eli,
Right.
but he's God's judge and prophet.
Mm-hmm.
And for him to also serve as high priest while serving as judge probably was something either God didn't want Samuel doing, or he just simply was more than what one man could handle.
Right. Okay.
And also, at this point, at Samuel's own admission, he's an old man by this point.
He's tired.
And so Samuel's probably at home somewhere just shaking his head going, praying for them, but like, I ain't getting into this.
Ahijah's likely a young man about Jonathan's age.
More than likely. So Ahijah's physically much more capable of doing the job.
So Samuel never was a high priest.
No, more than likely not.
Okay.
All right. Also, notice at the end of verse 3, it tells us that Jonathan and his armor bearer snuck off. Nobody knows they're gone. All right, verse 4 says, In between the passes by which Jonathan sought to cross over to the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp crag on the one side and a sharp crag on the other side. And the name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other Senna. By the way, what's that?
There's something about those rocks.
Well, this tells us that this particular, and the reason the names of these are given to us is it tells us that it's an area that was well known enough that it had a name.
Yeah.
Now, according to my research, the meanings of those names in Hebrew were kind of obscure, that nobody really knew for sure what the names meant, but obviously they had a name. The one crag rose on the north opposite Michmash, and the other on the south opposite Geba. By the way, Michmash is about probably about 5 or 6 miles north of where Saul's army was stationed at this particular point. Then Jonathan said to the young man who was carrying his armor, "Come and let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us, for the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few." Now, there's two things in here. Notice how Jonathan refers to the Philistines.
They're circumcised.
Yeah, which basically, that was a Hebrew insult that basically said these, to put it politely, these dirtbag barbarians from the other side of the railroad tracks.
The infidels.
The infidels.
You
Yeah, to refer to somebody as the uncircumcised, yeah, in Hebrew that was a dirty insult.
Mine says
Not
pagans.
what's that?
Pagans.
Yeah, not necessarily meaning that it was profanity, but it basically was. It wasn't a nice compliment. And the second thing we see is, notice how Jonathan describes this. He says, "The Lord is not restrained to save by many or a few." Now, it's only Jonathan and his armor bearer, 2 men, that's it. And they're also climbing up a rock face in between, basically a crevice in this hillside, which, if you know anything about geography, if they're having to climb up between a jagged rock face, their hands are busy trying to hold on. You can't exactly be fighting a battle while you're stuck, in that. And if the Philistines knew they were down there trying to climb up, what do you think the Philistines would do to them? They're probably throwing rocks and, arrows and things like that at them. Because not any way you can fight back. That's like, trying to climb a side of a cliff while the people at the top are shooting at you. Mm-hmm. But with all that being said, Saul, who pretty much didn't even think about what God had to do with anything, is the exact opposite of what we see with Jonathan. Only thing out of Jonathan's mouth about this whole thing is, well, let's go climb this rock face and see what kind of trouble we can start, because we know God can fight this battle with a whole bunch of us or even just a few of us. Jonathan's expressing the faith at this point that even with just the 2 of us, God will protect us.
And it's interesting that Jonathan didn't have an angel come to him and tell him, "Whittle down your force to make it small." Jonathan just went out with him and his armor bearer on his own.
That's it.
With stepping off in faith.
Mm-hmm. And that's the difference between Jonathan and his dad Saul. You get the impression Saul basically barely had enough brain power to rub 2 brain cells together, and Jonathan clearly is the exact opposite. He's intelligent, he's a man of faith, and he figures, I don't care if just 2 of us, God's going to take care of us.
Saul's pretty lazy too, and
Jonathan's
pretty motivated.
Yep. Now it's interesting, the next thing that we see here though, verse 7, "And his armor bearer said to him, 'Do all that is in your heart, turn yourself, and here I am with you according to your desire.'" Now, in the original Hebrew, this has been reworded a little bit to make it make sense in English, because in the original Hebrew, literally what his armor bearer said is, "I'm with you like your heart's with you." In other words, wherever you go, I'm right there. You're not getting rid of me. I'm right here behind you. Then Jonathan said, "Behold, We will cross over to the men and reveal ourselves to them. Now, for anybody that knows anything about fighting a battle, what's he just done?
We're here.
Yeah, it's like standing going, hey guys, we're coming. He's intentionally eliminated the element of surprise.
That doesn't make a lot of sense.
No, it doesn't. But the question is not what he did, but why he did it. Again, Jonathan, unlike Saul, Jonathan is so convinced God's got this under control, God is basically rubbing it in the Philistines' nose.
Well, basically, it's God said so.
Exactly. And this just tells you that Jonathan's not at all concerned about anything because he's got that much faith to believe that God's got this under control no matter what we do. What's that?
He did today.
Well, verse 9. This is the interesting part here. If they say to us, wait until we come to you, then we will stand in our place and not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hands, and this shall be the sign to us. Now, how Jonathan has come up with this idea that, well, if they say we're coming for you, then he said we're not going to climb up. We'll know that God's not in this. But he's saying if on the other hand, if they say, come on up here, that he's somehow convinced that that'll be the sign that tells him that God has given him the go-ahead to go do this. Now again, how he comes up with this, we can only guess. Maybe Jonathan just decided this, and that's what he prayed, that God, if they do this, we'll know that you're sending us on. Verse 11. And when both of them revealed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines said, behold, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they've hidden themselves. Again, I think this is pretty obvious. The Philistines are now mocking them, saying, oh, those cowardly Jews are coming out of the rocks. So the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, come up to us and we will tell you something. Well, the bottom line was in Hebrew, basically what they said, come up here and we'll teach you a lesson. They're not just going to tell them something, they're going to show them something. And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hands of Israel. Now, again, notice how Jonathan mentions this. He didn't just say, God's given them into our hands. He's given credit for this to God's people. He said, God's given them into the hands of Israel. Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, which, by the way, that tells you what kind of landscape they're in here. If he's having to climb up on his hands and feet, he's climbing up a rock face. And with his armor bearer behind him, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer put some to death after him. And that first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men within about a half a furrow in an acre of land. In other words, in the space of the land of what I've got here in this yard, he put 20 Philistines to death. And keep in mind, only Jonathan, when they went into this, had a sword. Now, the likelihood that his armor bearer finished the battle with a sword, probably pretty good, because where do you think the armor bearer would have gotten one from?
Number one on the ground.
Yeah, the number one on the ground is like, hey dude, get his sword. Pick up his sword and follow me. Now, how in the world two men managed to defeat 20 of them coming after him, we can only guess. But, I mean, that just tells you that Jonathan had the faith that God was going to deal with it.
He didn't catch him by surprise. They weren't sleeping. They were up there waiting for him.
They were waiting on him.
Come on down.
And he's exhausted after climbing up and still took them all out.
Hey, face it, they went to the Chuck Norris School of
Apparently. And that's another good point. The fact that he's climbing up a rock face, he and his armor bearer were probably out of breath by the time they got to the top, and still whipped 20 of them. And there was a trembling in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. Even the garrison and the raiders trembled, and the earth quaked, so that it became a great trembling. Now, verse 15 is important. Jonathan and his armor bearer, 2 men, one of whom went into the battle unarmed, basically, kills 20 Philistines. Then immediately after that, there was an earthquake. Now, the Philistines were a seriously superstitious pagan people. They just lost 20 of their soldiers, and then suddenly there's an earthquake. What do you think the Philistines were thinking?
We're in trouble.
The gods are against us.
The gods have done this. The gods are against us. And they were half right in that it was the God was against them. But this tells us why immediately after that, the Philistines start running for their lives. Because they figured there's only 2 of them, but if their God has done this, we got to run. Because also, what had the Philistines already seen, or what's been their experience with this Israelite God?
He can wipe them all out when he wants to.
Yeah, they already know that if the Israelite God gets involved in it, they're dead men. Because it's already happened to them once. And they are scared to death when they see an earthquake happen right after this. They are convinced this is a divine occurrence and we got to get out of here. We are not going to take on these Israelites today. Now, while that's going on, verse 16, by the way, if you wonder, we're going to go down through verse 23, and as far as we're going for tonight. Now Saul's watchmen in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude melted away, and they went here and there. And Saul said to the people who were with him, number now. In other words, in Hebrew, it's basically muster them up. In other words, call a formation so we can get an accountability of who's here. Number now, and see who is gone from us. And when they had numbered, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. So what we see here is that Saul has got his men up in the trees or up on the mountaintop watching, and they see the Philistines are running for the hills. Something's going on. And Saul's at least got enough common sense to realize this is our opportunity. So he calls a formation and realizes everybody's accounted for except for Jonathan and his armor bearer. So now they know who it is that's over there causing the ruckus. Then Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God here, for the ark of God was at that time with the sons of Israel. In other words, again, as I mentioned, there is no tabernacle at this point. So wherever they went, the Levites carried the ark with them. So he tells Ahijah to bring the ark up. Now, this could go either way as to whether this is a compliment or a condemnation. If Saul is calling for the ark because he wants to offer a sacrifice and pray before they pursue this, that would have been to his credit. But if on the other hand, he just wants to bring the ark up there because he thinks the ark is their good luck charm, that would have just proven the stupidity of Saul. Which of these it is, we have no way of knowing, and it's even possible that it might have been a little of both. But what happens next tells us that Saul still doesn't get it. Verse 19 says, and it happened while Saul talked to the priest that the commotion in the camp of the Philistines continued and increased. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. In other words, they probably at this point, Ahijah had prepared an animal. He's got the sheep or the goat, whatever they're going to sacrifice, on the altar, ready to make the sacrifice. And Saul tells him, hold on, skip it. We don't have time for that. So when he says withdraw your hand, that's what he means is don't slaughter him.
In other words, don't give God credit.
Yeah,
We
basically.
ain't got time.
Yeah. I got time for that.
They were going to offer a sacrifice here and ask for God's guidance in this, and Saul sees the Philistines getting away and thinks, we ain't got time for a sacrifice. We got to chase those Philistines. So, Ahijah, forget it. You know, get on out of here. Not a good thing. Because even if the Philistines had continued running, the lesson for Saul should have been there's always time to pray and have a sacrifice. Because God could have orchestrated whatever God wanted to do. But Saul is so bent on doing what Saul wants to do when Saul wants to do it, he tells Ahijah, just go away and let's skip the sacrifice. All right, verse 20. Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and came to the battle, and behold, every man's sword was against his fellow, and there was a great confusion. In other words, the Philistines at this point are in such a hurry to get away, they're now fighting among themselves. Also, keep in mind, there apparently were some Israelite deserters that were in the Philistine army at this point. And the Israelite deserters, now seeing the Philistines run, they have turned on the Philistines. And if you're wondering, how do we know this? It tells us just a verse or two later, or verse 21 actually. It says, now the Hebrews who were with the Philistines previously, who went up with them all around in the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines had fled, even they also pursued them closely in the battle. So you got all the deserters who were hiding in the hills. They hear the ruckus going on a couple of miles over, and now they're coming out of the woodwork. The deserters who had gone and joined with the Philistines have now turned and deserted against the Philistines. Frankly, I think if I'd been Saul, I don't think I'd trust them too much. So you got this total confusion going on with the Philistines. Verse 23, so the Lord delivered Israel that day, and the battle spread beyond Beth-aven. Now, that's our stopping point for today, but that's only about, again, half the story. The rest, which we'll get to Sunday evening, we find that Saul, in lieu of offering a sacrifice, decides that it's a good idea to put a curse on all his men.
Awesome.
Yeah, and it just shows that Saul, even if he had the wherewithal to be a good military commander, the man is just stupid.
Spiritually an idiot.
What's that?
Spiritually an idiot.
Spiritually just not there.
Yeah.
Thinking only of himself.
Pretty much. So anyway, questions up to this point? All right.